Allie, my youngest daughter, and I have been binge watching Blue Bloods. Has anybody else seen that? Yeah, now some of you will remember that I said I was binge watching Blue Bloods back in November, but there's 8 seasons and there's 22 episodes per season, so I'll be binge watching for some time. But I like the show because it's kind of a cop drama, but it centers around a family and that are all in law enforcement at one level or another. But the thing that I really like is at least once an episode, it brings it down to a dining room. And the entire family sits around a dining room table and they just talk about their lives. They talk about how things are going. They talk about, wrestling with issues. They fight with each other. I mean, it's like real family. But there's this moment where they all come together and are in each other's lives and caring for one another. And so it was at one of the dining table scenes that one of the youngest ones said a line that I found shocking, and it was, I'm realizing that whenever I'm away from this table, that it's every person for themselves. And I thought, really? And then I thought, really? I mean, I look around at a lot of people. It sounds really harsh, but I think it's true. I watch a lot of people who are basically in it for themselves and live their entire lives that way, taking care of themselves pretty much only. And on the one hand, that has this kind of rugged individually type sound to it. I am the captain of my destiny. I make my own successes. But on the other hand, what it means is that there are a lot of overlooked hurting people out there. Because people, as I have observed it, have a stunning ability to ignore other people and other people's challenges and only see how life affects them. But then I thought a little bit more about that, and then I thought, but not everybody. Irv Hughes wasn't in it for himself when he spent summers mentoring me and teaching me what it was like to be a person who followed Jesus. Phyllis Johnson wasn't in it for herself when we had our first child and Megan was working full-time and I was working full-time and we had this baby and we thought, what do we do with the kid? And Phyllis Johnson, a member of our church, came to us one day and said, I will take care of her every single day, all day, for free, so you too can do what God has called you to do. Phyllis wasn't in it for herself. Almost 10 years ago, Jim and Blake and Spencer Graffey and Ardell Johnston and Thor Erickson and Jim Skiffington weren't in it for themselves when they drove all the way to California and loaded up a truck filled with our possessions and drove it back to Gig Harbor. When a tree fell over in my yard during a storm a couple of years ago, Franklin Thornton and Rick Potter weren't in it for themselves when they came over to my house and helped me cut it up and haul it away. And when I say they helped me cut it up and haul it away, what I mean is I stood there and watched them do the work. And I could go on and on and on of examples of people in our church and who have been Jesus followers, who live their life differently, who aren't in it just for themselves. And you have to ask the question, why? So take a look with me in John chapter 13 today. John writes, it was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. We live among people whose value is everyone for themselves. We're surrounded by people whose perspective on life is, I've got mine, I'm set, too bad for you. But not everybody. There's all the people that I mentioned and so many others. And they're different because they follow someone who didn't overlook other people's needs. They follow someone who didn't overlook other people. They follow someone who didn't overlook them. And this passage is so central to understanding it. It says in the passage, in verse 1 and verse 3, twice, Jesus knew. Jesus knew something. And then it goes on to say three things that Jesus knew during this passage. The first is, Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave. The second, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. And the third thing Jesus knew was that he had come from God and was returning to God. So let's look at those for just a second. Jesus knew that the hour had come. So cue the deep instruments and the dark music. This is an ominous statement. Jesus knew that the hour had come. It wasn't like, oh, we got to leave to catch the plane kind of, the hour has come. It was like, this is the moment that I have lived to this point for. This is what God has designed for me. And it is going to be hard. Because what does the hour had come mean for Jesus? It means that what God had for him is about to happen. It means that the salvation of the world that God had designed from the very first moment when we all messed up and continued to mess up, that was about to be accomplished. And Jesus knows how that's going to be accomplished. Jesus knows that within the next 24 hours that he is going to be beaten, that he is going to be broken, and that he's going to die. Jesus knew that the hour had come. Now, in Greek, and some of you who don't care about Greek, just tune out for just a second. Others of you are about to get very excited. In Greek, there's two concepts of time. There is chronos, which is just everyday time. You know, I've got a doctor's appointment at 11. I'm meeting a friend for lunch at 12:30. At 3 o'clock, I've got a tea time. That's TEE, just so you know. That's chronos. It's just everyday time. There's another time, which is Kairos time. Kairos is a moment that is pregnant with possibility. Kairos is God time. And so Jesus wasn't saying, oh, I see it's 10 o'clock, the time has come. What Jesus is saying is, this is a God moment. We have come to this pregnant moment in time that is qualitatively different from other moments in time because God is going to do something here. And it is going to be rough. Jesus knew exactly what was going on. He knew that all of time had focused on this Kairos moment. And in that Kairos God pregnant moment, Jesus also knew something else. He knew that the Father had put all things under his power. So as followers of Jesus, we believe that the universe and everything that is was created by God speaking it into existence. That God created everything and that God sustains everything. Everything happens and is ordered by the laws of nature which were instituted by the power of God. So God is the omnipotent, creating, sustaining, about to become the redeeming God of the universe. And he takes all of this power that can create universes, that can sustain planets in their orbits and comets hurtling through space. He takes all of that power and he gives it to Jesus. So what does that power look like for Jesus? It seems to me that it can look like two things. He knows that the creating, sustaining God of the universe gives all this power to him, and it's the power that he has to make things right. Jesus has now been given the power to fix the stuff that's wrong. So because we believe that God created everything good, God created everything perfect, and we messed it up. And God didn't just go, well, they kind of messed that up, let's start over again. God goes, I'm going to fix this thing. And the way that he chose to fix things was through Jesus. Through his sinless life, through his atoning death on the cross, and through the power of God at his resurrection, which tells us that if we die with Christ, that we will also be raised with him. The God of the universe has given him this power to make things right in this Kairos moment. But it's also a different kind of power. Because in that moment, God gives him the power to say no. Now, you've read the end of the book, and so you know that Jesus doesn't say no. But in that moment, I believe all of creation held its breath because Jesus had the power to say no. And if you go on to read the story, you see this fleshed out a little bit in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus wrestles with God and says, is there another way we can do this thing? So Jesus has the power to fix it. Jesus also has the power to say no. But his choice is informed by the third thing that Jesus knows. Jesus knows who he is. He knows that he came from God, and he knows that he is going back to God. And when you know who you are, and when you know where you are headed, it gives you the freedom to be your true and authentic self. You don't have to be who you are not, which is what a lot of us struggle with a lot of the time. But Jesus knew who he was, he knew where he was going, and he knew that he had been sent to accomplish God's purpose in this Kairos moment. And so the thing that he does with the power is he chooses to say yes. And those things that Jesus knew affected what happens next. Because when Jesus was about to have the full weight of all of the evil of the universe, when Jesus was about to have every sin that had ever been committed, that ever would be committed throughout all time, when Jesus was about to have all of that set on his shoulders, he didn't call 10,000 angels. He didn't call Tony Stark or the Avengers. What Jesus does is this amazing act of self-humiliation. Jesus has the power to fix things, and so he picks up a towel, because that's how you fix things. And in verse 1, it says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. That means to the end of his life, but that also means to every extent he possibly could. And so the foot washing is an example of love going to the limit. It's this concrete embodiment of love. At this Kairos pregnant moment in time, Jesus doesn't give his disciples a sermon. Jesus does something to show them what service looks like. Jesus takes a moment and he washes his disciples' feet. And then he gives them this instruction in verse 14. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. So how do we apply those things? If we're supposed to do what Jesus did there, how do we apply those things to our lives? The first thing is this idea about an hour coming, Kairos moments in our life. We live with the tyranny of the Chronos moments in our lives, of our to-do list, of our jobs, of our obligations, of the demands that people place on us, of the stuff that just has to be done. But there are moments in our lives that we are aware, at least on some level, that there's a possibility here. That's a Kairos moment. Whether it's the moment to speak truth into somebody's life, to care for them, to show empathy, we all have these Kairos moments in our lives. And the trick for us is to throw off the tyranny of the Chronos so that we can pay attention to the Kairos. Because oftentimes somebody will come into our lives, and I'm not talking something spectacular. I'm talking the coworker who finally says to you, my husband is an alcoholic. And you go, late for lunch. Now that's extreme, but we do that all the time. There's these little bits of God moments, and we are tyrannized by the next thing we have to do. Jesus was aware of the Kairos moments in his life. How do we become aware of that? So when God opens up the possibility for us to engage with somebody else, we're paying attention enough. Because just like Jesus, in all of those moments, we have the power. We have the power to engage. We have the power to bring healing. We have the power to bring hope. We have the power to bring empathy and care. But we also have the power to say no. And most of us are good people. So it's not like we would say no out of maliciousness. We would say no out of busyness. We have the power. God brings these Kairos moments in our lives, And we have the power to say yes and participate in the redemptive work of God, and we have the power to say no. The reason that Jesus says yes to God is because he knows who he is. And sometimes I wonder if we don't struggle with our identities, if we don't have the power of knowing who we are. If there's all these lists of things that we feel like we want to be, or that culture or that people in our lives tell us that we are supposed to be, and we're crushed underneath the weight of those things. But instead, we have this identity somewhat akin to Jesus in Christ, which says that we are a child of God who is deeply loved and deeply valued and is called by God to participate in God's plan and purpose with him. How many of us actually find our identity in that? Because that identity is clarifying. Because like every other church in the entire world, one of the things that we say we are about is about bringing people to Christ. Statistically speaking, 97% of the churches in the United States see no conversion in any given year or decade. Conversion is not, I was a Baptist and I moved someplace else and now I go to a Presbyterian church. That's not conversion. Conversion is, I didn't know Jesus and now I do. So we all have that in our statements and our mission statements, and only 3% of churches are actually doing that. Which makes me wonder, do we understand who we are? Because if we understood and had that passion to actually see people come to Christ, that would help us open up our eyes to the Kairos moments and use the opportunities, the power that we have to take advantage of that. Jesus, in that Kairos moment, took the opportunity to serve the people who are right in front of them. How many Kairos moments are going to happen this next week in your life that you can take advantage of for the glory of God? Now, if you're around church long enough, we kind of act like foot washing is normal. Foot washing is not normal. In our culture, foot washing is just strange. If you take a group of people who are not Christians and you say, I really love you guys and I want to serve you, would you all take your shoes off because I'm going to wash your feet? You'd be the only person left in the room. The point is not, and now foot washing has been very, very meaningful. I get it. Every year during Lent on Maundy Thursday, I see pictures of the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, kneeling down and washing the feet of 12 convicts or something. And I get it. I understand. This is an act of humiliation of saying, there is no place that I won't go to bring you home, which is exactly what Jesus is saying. But you have to translate that to your own situation. What's the need of the person in front of you? And one of the points of foot washing is Jesus is saying God will go to any length. It's not like there's this floor and God won't go any deeper than that. Like there's the chance that you finally get around to confessing that deep, dark sin in your life that you just thought of when I brought it up. And God looks at that and says, oh, that one's beyond the pale. Which is what you're worried about. Foot washing says that there's no need that you have, that God won't go, I can help with that. And I will help with that. And so that's the call to us too. I mean, what level are you not willing to go to? And, we all think of the extreme. I'm not talking about somebody who's necessarily lying in the gutter, although maybe you should be paying attention to that too. Most of the time, what God is calling us to is the ordinary. It's the people we already know. Is there somebody that you already love? Is there somebody that you already care for that needs help? And you might be a little bit squeamish about that because that's a little bit outside of my comfort zone. That's the foot washing that maybe Jesus is calling you to. What are the concrete steps that we can take to serve others, to take advantage of the Kairos moments, to meet the need that they actually have? So what does all this teach us about God? I think it teaches us that we have the same reaction Peter has. When Jesus comes to Peter and says, I want to wash your feet, Peter goes, what? Not in the weird, creepy, don't touch my feet, but in I've never experienced a God who was like that. That's the God that Jesus reveals. Now think about that. Do you know of any other God who reveals himself as the God that will enter into your mess and fix it? Every other God that I know of sits on Mount Olympus and waits for you to propitiate him or her, is waiting for you to sacrifice your child for him. God says, no, I'll sacrifice my child for you. And I think Peter goes, wow, I'm overwhelmed by the depth that you will go to love me. When you need your feet washed, God will do that. No matter what you have done, no matter what you have said, no matter how concerned you are that it is beyond the pale, God is not above doing anything to bring people like me and people like you back home. And Peter is taken aback by that. You're going to care for me like that? We have this potent power when we serve, because it gets people's attention. Because most people are used to being ignored. Most people are used to being treated by other people like they don't matter. And so when you stop and do even a remote kindness, it catches people's attention. I was reading a lot this week, and I came across this great quote, and I neglected to write down who wrote it, so sorry about that. But I liked it. Whoever it was said, "Seeing the church in action is an incredibly powerful experience for non-believers. God's compassion flows when we sacrificially care for those on the margins. The banner of God's justice is lifted as the oppressed are liberated. God's mercy is on display as the widow and the orphan are protected. As you and your church serve those who are in distress and desperate, bring your non-Christian friends along. They will experience the joy of service, the spirit of team, and the hope of God." That's who we are. Bring our friends along because they'll be blown away by the stuff that we do. One of the other characteristics of our current culture is that there is a high value placed on experiential learning. Say what you want, but what will you actually do? There's a whole generation and more of people who are looking for not what comes out of your mouth, but comes out of the works of your hands. They're not looking for a well thought out theology, as important as that is, but for a well lived out dedication to Jesus. I was haunted this week by somebody who said to me, as Christians, if we're not here to serve, we're here to consume. And I was haunted by that because it rings true. If we're not serving, if we're not participating in the work of God, then we're just consuming. And then that began to make sense for me, because that's why I think it's not easy to come to Harbor Covenant, because we have expectations. We have this picture of what Jesus followers look like. We have this picture of what Jesus followers do, and it's a lot of work. There are any number of places that you can go that you can hear a very pleasant and entertaining sermon that will just remind you that you are terrific and require nothing of you, where you can sing the songs that you want to and then go off and do whatever you want to with your life. There are all sorts of churches where you can find that. We're not like that here. If you have money, I will continue to give you opportunities to give that money away to affect other people. If you have time, if you've got talents, if you can serve, I will continue to present opportunities to you where the gifts that you have to share with other people will transform their lives. We will be on one another and continually holding one another accountable to live the way that Jesus calls us to live, because when Jesus lived his way, it transformed the world. And Jesus calls us to do that same thing. And so it's not easy to come to Harbor Covenant. It's hard. Because in a culture that lives only for itself, we keep talking about how can we give our lives away for others, because that's what Jesus does for us. And just like Peter, when people come into contact with the way that we serve, their reaction is, why would you do that? I mean, why would you give your money away to help someone else? You worked hard for that money. You got an education for that money. You spent lots of hours. You inherited it. Somebody else didn't. I mean, let them get their own money. Why would you take your money and give it to somebody else? That's crazy talk. Why are you spending your vacation on a missions trip to India or to Alaska or to Hawaii? Why would you lead the Bible study up at the women's prison? Why would you hang out with them up there? Why would you mow your neighbor's lawn? Why would you pull weeds at Easter seals? Or build furniture at the furniture bank? Or build a yurt in Alaska? Why would you bring dinner to a sick friend? Why would you stand out in the rain to help park cars for the living nativity? Why would you give thousands of dollars worth of school supplies to underprivileged kids at Harbor Heights? Because you can. And because Jesus demands it of us. And because our lives have been changed by the God who notices us and enters into our lives. We also serve out of weakness. I don't know if we always think about that. And that's actually what Jesus did. Jesus put aside all of his strength and actually served out of his weakness. And that changes people's lives too. We serve out of our weakness when we share about the difficult times we're going through or the difficult times we've been through. When we say, you know what? My marriage has been rough sometimes. In fact, it got so rough, we just couldn't hold it together anymore. We serve out of our weakness. When we share that because of orthodontia, our kids have perfect teeth, but man, they're making crazy decisions. We share when we talk about that we haven't all got it together. We share out of our weakness when we empathize with somebody else and say, yeah, I've been there. I've been there too. Not everything always goes well. But when we share out of our weakness, it gives other people the hope that God is present in the valleys and that God can redeem their struggles and their failures just as the way that he has done yours. We do this wonderful job of reflecting Jesus to our community, of serving around the world. Sometimes I think the challenge for us is to bring that down to a personal level. We serve out here, but it is much more difficult to serve and love and care for the people that are right next to us, the people that we work with, the people that are in our families, the people that we have been praying for. And we talk about that, and I struggle with that too. Last week I gave you some examples about things that would be great for you to do. And I talked to people during the week like, Michael, we didn't even know people like that. Like, okay, but what are the people you do know? Because often the Kairos moment is with the people that you already know. It's just paying attention to that. And we want to reach people for Christ, not so that we can put another notch in our collective belts, but because we want the people that we know and love to know the hope and the healing and the peace and the joy that we have found in him. And so we want to be passionate about people knowing Jesus. I'm passionate about people knowing Jesus. There's nothing that brings me more joy than when somebody who doesn't know Jesus comes to know Jesus. And I struggle with this. And I don't cut myself any slack. I would love to get up here and week after week go, here's 4 things that you all should be doing to evangelize your neighborhood. Go. And me not do it. And I'm struggling with those opportunities. When we were in Stockton, I lived in a neighborhood that we claimed for Jesus. Half of them were not Jesus followers. We were in our neighbors' lives. God worked through us and transformed things. We were heavily involved in the community. In Gig Harbor, I barely know a non-Christian person. And so the question that I look at for myself is, what am I going to do about that? Will I just go, oh, well, I don't know a non-Christian person? Or will I look for those opportunities to engage with people so that I might be able to love and care and serve for them too? And I'm discovering that the bar is really low for people caring about one another because everybody lives in this society that says you're not important. I am, but you aren't. A couple of weeks ago, Allie, my youngest daughter, was telling about an interaction that she had with one of her friends at school. And she did this little kindness. Now, Allie's a great kid. She would have done a huge kindness. But in this situation, it was just this little kindness. And she came home and she was like, Mom, Dad, I can't believe how blown away they were. They just kept saying, I can't believe you'd do this for me. And I went, their bar's really low, isn't it? I mean, if that was all it took for them to go, wow, I'm blown away. But isn't it true? We're surrounded by people who don't know that anybody on the face of the planet cares about them. And all we have to do is take that moment to care just a little bit. And they go, wow, you'd do that for me? Why? And there's your Kairos moment. And that's why we're doing this sermon series. Because we all know people who are dying. We all know people who need to be forgiven. We all know people who need to know that they can have a second chance. And so we've been talking in this sermon series about how we can pray for people so that God will work, that God is working in their lives, to open up conversations, about how we can listen to people and hear with spiritual ears where God is already at work in their lives. We talked last week about the sacramental nature of sharing a meal together because it says we accept you, we love you, we care for you, and the opportunities that opens up for conversation. And then this week, the idea of simply taking advantage of the Kairos moments to love and care and serve for people. So with those things in mind, I have 3 questions for you to think about for a minute. The first is, how does Jesus washing his disciples' feet impact your view of God? Second, what resource do you have that you could use for the kingdom of God? Jesus had a towel. What do you have? And third, what need could you help meet this week? Let's pray and consider those things. Loving God, everything that we have been talking about is all because of the type of God you are. You're the God who doesn't stand far away from us. You're the God who enters into our lives. You know the stuff that we have done, and there's nothing that causes you to walk away from us. You just keep offering us help. And you enter into our lives at the point of our need. God, for those people who have just prayed for you to come into their lives, would you do that in a powerful way so that they know that you are real? Would you give them a peace that passes all understanding and a joy that's incomprehensible? And would you bring around them the type of people who will love them in the way that I have been loved in your name, and that so many others have too? God, for others of us that have prayed for opportunity, would you open up our eyes and make us willing? In Jesus' name, amen.